Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate.
We believe that there's an option for every student.
We are there to help students and serve them. It's our mission.
And education is transformational. It changes lives.
Nicer.
Oh, I mean, several
That's cool.
It's been a while. She lives in D.C. We both used to live in D.C. I now live in Oakland. And we were just part of the same group. Yeah, that's what the scene's all about. I don't know who's this is, but
Looks like you might have a whole
You might have
thing to talk about
a
now.
brand new yellow legal pad. All right, we good, you guys?
I think so.
All right.
yeah, well, tennis.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Paul Cure. You are at CWA panel 3601, 180 degrees, flipping your life trajectory. In this CWA session, we will utilize both the CWA app and a note card system. There are two producers around the room to receive questions from the audience. To ask a question in the app, simply select this session in the schedule, tap Q&A, and then insert and send your question. You may also raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. You must write legibly. If you are a student or attending remotely, please note this in your question. Make your questions brief and to the point. Well, as we were kind of just meeting before this panel, it seemed like the whole topic was about bias and identity. And so if you're going to be flipping your life trajectory, it's probably best that we not know and let it be revealed what it is that you might be becoming. So we're going to kind of go down the line, and the question that I'll pose first is, what was the biggest obstacle that you've encountered to kind of make that life trajectory?
To make that, I assume that I'm going to go first.
Yeah,
Okay.
Brandon's going to go first.
And so what the question is, what, can you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Yeah. So what was the first obstacle, whether it be from yourself, your own courage, your own fear, that you encountered that inspired or was the obstacle that you had to overcome?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure that I can pick just one, but
Tell us your life story.
no.
Yeah.
Don't do that. We don't have that much time. Well, I was talking to a group of people actually earlier today in one of the panels. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Y'all let me know if I get too loud. Okay. Yeah. Right. I was born in Oklahoma City. Has anyone ever been to Oklahoma or lived in Oklahoma? Okay, put your hand down if you've just driven through Oklahoma, but have you actually lived in Oklahoma? Anyone? There's one, there's two. I promise you, three. This has never happened before in my life, where three people have before lived in Oklahoma. I'm glad you're here, okay? And that you're out of Oklahoma. In 1921, a young black boy, tripped over a elevator operator's foot on his way out of the elevator. She was a white girl who was the elevator operator, and she cried to her family that the young boy, who was a teenager, had raped her and sexually harassed her. That family went after and went looking for that young boy. When they could not find that young boy, they spent the next 2 or 3 days looking for them. When they could not find that young boy, they commenced to destroying the most wealthiest African American community in the history of the United States of America. In 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a community called Greenwood, Oklahoma, it was the largest race massacre in our history with regard to that state. That's where I was born, right? I was born, my grandfather was one of the first African-American men to ever own a nightclub in the heart of Oklahoma City. He closed his doors shortly after that because police had harassed him for so long. And his customers did not want to come. He couldn't provide for his family. He consequently turned to alcoholism, and he passed away when I was 19 years old. I met him for the first time when I was 16 years old. I was born to his daughter, my mother, who in early 1990s was at a traffic stop, and a police officer had planted drugs on her. And she was charged with a paraphernalia charge of crack cocaine. She had never done drugs before in her life. My mom became addicted to crack cocaine in prison. She lost her rights to me. I met her for the first time when I was 15 years old. The experience that I've had over a lifetime has taught me one thing, that love is the most delicate and indestructible thing that I've ever experienced in my life. And a part of that love was meeting a young boy in the 3rd grade English class who I eventually fell in love with when I was 15 years old. And I joke about this, but it's truly the case that it was like falling asleep in class. It's absolutely something I did not mean to do, but I just did. And that love carried us throughout everything from high school to homelessness. And we lived in an abandoned shelter, in an abandoned house for 2 years. And that's the place that I fell in love. In a house that a family left next to a car lot that no one visited. A year later, that boy, that man, proposed to me, and it was the happiest day of my life. And he told me, I can live 1,000 lives, and in each of them, find my way back to you. And so if anyone has ever proposed to you like that before, you're probably married right now, which was almost the case for me, except 1 year later, I lost the life and the love that I had invested in. In 2007, I lost my lifetime partner to police violence during a routine traffic stop. He was shot and killed in the head because he did not want to get out of his car in a dark alley for a car with which the police had described being stolen, of which we saved more than 2 years buying. His love was radical, unapologetic, and it completely changed my life.
So hi, everybody. Thank you for sharing that with us. So I've been thinking about what has been hard for me, and I think sometimes a lot of it is that expectation that we hold of ourselves. I try and hold myself to very high standards, and so I have 2 particular situations that have flipped my life's trajectory, and I think letting go of those preconceived notions of what one should do is hard. And so the first time for me was actually when I was in college. I studied abroad in Turkey, so merhaba to all of you. And it was actually in Turkish class that I was fortunate enough to meet a lot of diplomats. And at that point in time, I really wanted to be a diplomat. So I wanted to live abroad and experience life abroad on behalf of the United States. And through those connections I made with the diplomats, I realized it really wasn't the life that I wanted to live. I love the people, but for me, I also really like my independence on some level. Maybe that's why I'm an entrepreneur now. And I don't necessarily always like being told what to do, and if I don't agree with something, it's really hard for me to enact it. And so I went back to college at the University of Richmond, and I said, my goodness, I've thought that I've wanted to do this for so many years. What am I going to do now? And I'm someone who likes to plan, and so it was very difficult for me, but I was sitting in a philosophy class, and I watched Food Inc., and we were talking about that, and there's this one scene in it where a family's grocery shopping, and so it's, I think, a mom, a dad, and 2 kids, and they're going through the produce aisle, and they're trying to figure out what they want to do. Do they want to buy these fruits and vegetables to feed their family and feed their kids, or do they want to spend the money on diabetes medicine because the dad really needs it? And I was watching that, and I said, this shouldn't be happening in the United States of America. What can I do to fix it? And so at that point, I really thought the path that I would be going was starting a healthy fast food restaurant in food deserts. And so I was a senior in college. I went to McDonald's. I got a job to try and learn from the largest company on how they make that work. And I did that for a few months, and it was a very eye-opening experience for me. I had one of the best bosses I've ever had working at McDonald's. And so it was definitely a learning opportunity. And then from there, I wanted to go in the natural and organic industry. And so I drove the Hain Celestial Group nuts until they gave me a job. I was really willing to do whatever they'd let me do to get in the door. And so Celestial Seasonings, you might all be familiar. It's not too far from right here, but it's one of the 50-plus brands in the Hain Celestial portfolio. And so I graduated from college, and I ended up becoming the North Carolina key account sales rep and driving around a lot and learning the business. And then I was fortunate to have a great mentor who got me promoted about a year and a half in. And so I went from driving around a state to flying around the country working with different distributors. And so about I'd say a year and a half into that, I had another life change where I was visiting one of those distributors and taking just kind of a routine tour of the factory. It seemed completely casual, and they were so proud of how high their ceiling was and how you could see everything from there. And so part of the tour was get up on this lift and go check it out. And so it seemed totally nonchalant and routine, and I said, okay, I'm gonna make my customers happy, that's my job. And I wasn't afraid of heights, and so I got on that lift with the operator, and then it got stuck at the top. And I was up there and was like, okay, I really wanna get off of this. 70 feet's a whole lot higher than I thought. And after a while, the lift dropped. And so when that happened, it was absolutely awful, where it didn't fall the whole way. And so once I realized that, it was really scary because I thought that any second it was gonna fall again. And mind you, I'd broken my back at that point. I had a spinal cord injury. So I was paralyzed. And then on top of it, thankfully I was wearing pants, but my tibia was sticking out of my leg. And so with that, it was every single second going, oh my gosh, this is my last second. My poor parents, I called to say my goodbyes. But that wasn't the end there for me, or fortunately the lift operator. We both made it through. But for someone who was used to traveling all around the country and being very independent, to go from that to being in the hospital, and then eventually staying in Chicago for close to 5 months for what was supposed to be a 36-hour work trip, was something. I couldn't go to the bathroom on my own. I still have to self-catheterize and all of that. And so with that, I had to change my life trajectory again. And so I ended up being the person who, as an international studies and world politics and diplomacy, who would avoid the business school at all costs in undergrad, decide that I needed to go get an MBA. And so I studied for the GMAT while I was pretty immobile on the couch in between going to physical therapy sessions. And then I was fortunately accepted to the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business and also their Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy to get a master's in public policy. And so I've been doing that, and I graduated last year, but during that whole process, I ended up coming across a tea that was developed by a naturopathic doctor for personal issues. I was the patient and kept getting UTIs, or urinary tract infections, as a result of having what's called a neurogenic bladder and breaking my back. And so I was facing antibiotic resistance and needed something else. And so when I came across that product and it worked for me, I said, my goodness, I need to use these skills that I'm developing and hopefully building and share the product with more people. And so that's what I'm doing now. Life has flipped. It's definitely different than it was before, but I'm trying to make the most of it. And so now we'll see what's next. Hopefully not too many more flips.
Brandon, Allie, thank you for sharing. I'm a little embarrassed because at least at this moment, my biggest challenge is 7 drinks, 5 hours of sleep, 3 panels. So if you see me tilting over, prop me back up, please. I'm kidding, kind of. I think for me, it wasn't one obstacle. I think for me, it was a concept. So something that's outside of your control, how others perceive you. Internally, I feel like my life has maybe not been a 180, but I've tacked course and pivoted numerous times over the past 5 years. Inevitably, when you do something that is in the public eye, you're cast as that, and there's a certain archetype of NFL football player. So that's a challenge, and it's something that's outside of my control. So at times it's been a point of frustration. I come from a place where I could be extremely successful in something else, and if I were to go back, it'd still be former NFL player, which is great, and I understand it. But in making an effort to broaden my bandwidth, reconciling the fact that you don't control others' perception of you, and just focusing on what you can control. Rather than elaborate more on my story, I'd actually like to share a friendship and the most interesting, kindest, smartest person I've ever met. His name is Pat Toomey. Does anybody know who Pat Toomey is? I hesitate to even describe Pat because he's ineffable. He played for 10 years in the NFL. During his career, wrote 2 best-selling books, one of which was On Any Given Sunday, which Oliver Stone turned into the film Any Given Sunday. Managed musicians. When he was 17, had top secret clearance to accompany his dad, who was a 2-star general in the Air Force, working on nuclear weapons. Was introduced to him through a guy named David Marinis, who's a writer and a mutual friend of Pat. And David's covered politics for the Washington Post and written numerous books. He's been around the smartest and most polymath people you could imagine, and refers to Pat as the smartest person he's ever met. You would never guess it. He's so grounded and so affable. Labors around with a bad knee. He'll wax philosophical about Jungian philosophy and then say, hey, do you want to go get a hot dog? And what I've learned from getting to know Pat better over the past few years about my life and his journey as a football player who also had a wide variety of interests is that it's really not a 180-degree change. Pat's got a few one-liners that I'll steal. Action precedes insight. Knowledge is the reward for doing. Go to the life. For someone that wasn't exactly sure what he wanted to do when he quit football and was cast into this role that he didn't really want to embody, that concept, I didn't know it before I met Pat, but I think I was doing it naturally. My bio may read football player, meditation teacher, and those may seem like wildly disparate things. The thrust behind them is the same. Connection, love. There's a lot of synergies between those two worlds that really aren't that different. And I got there by iterating. I was involved in this role that I wasn't thrilled about, but I went to life. I changed from really a lot of traumatic brain injury advocacy to making an intentional pivot to effective neuroscience. So what makes us happy and resilient and connected? That led me more to deepen my practice in meditation. And all the while, I think one thing that I really admire about Pat and that I'm trying to emulate is never abandoning where you came from. The beautiful thing is when something comes full circle. So if you've experienced a certain arena like the NFL, gone off and explored these other concepts, gone to life, acted before you had the insight, gained the knowledge, you get a chance to return and share it with folks that haven't, for whatever reason, been on that journey. And I can't tell you how good it feels. We ran a study a few years ago in meditation with former NFL players. And again, it seems so different, but it was a resounding success. And we have an opportunity to take what was a really big problem in that world and turn it into a positive. And in so doing, destigmatize or demystify the practice in places, like the Rust Belt where I grew up or the Deep South. And when you see Alabama's football team or Michigan's football team meditating, maybe a young kid who has mental health challenges or someone that has a stressful life at home has an example of folks they admire and can embody the practice. So thankful to have people like Pat in my life, lucky to have people like Pat in my life, and I'm just continuing to go to the light, continuing to act and learn and reflect. Thank you.
So, I think for me, like, my bio is probably like the worst description of who I am as a person, and all of the transitions that I took to get here. A lot of people look at me and they see me as somebody who helps formerly incarcerated people, or works with the last mile, or as a coder. And I did a lot of soul searching on how I saw myself as at one point a few years ago. And the three words that I came up with was coder, mentor, family guy, and reverse order. But the weird thing is like, I feel like I did a full 360 to really get to where I was, because if I look back at like how the hell it was that I made it here, I realized that for me it started all way back when I first immigrated to this country in '89 with my mom. We came here with dreams like many immigrants do, lawfully come, and things didn't quite work out. My mom was a victim of domestic violence. The person that she decided to marry took all her money, abused her, and we later lived for 3 years in a battered women's shelter. What that did for me at that point in my life is make me realize that I really had no idea how to communicate that to other people, especially because where we were relocated by the police department and by the battered women's shelter was into a pretty affluent neighborhood where everybody had very nice houses, and we shared a one-bedroom apartment, and I shared a sofa couch with my mom. And I was very self-conscious of letting people know who I was as a person and what my truth was. I realized that was really the precursor to my first 180 in my life. And my first 180 was going from being a normal kid to being somebody who didn't want to be himself. So I started dealing drugs, frankly, because I couldn't afford to buy them, and because some of my friends convinced me into doing it. As far as using it, and I enjoyed it recreationally, like most people do, and couldn't sustain a habit. I fast forward a little bit, but what ended up happening is I found myself in prison many years later. I looked down at my hands, and they're burned. 47% of my body is covered in third-degree burns. I went through a lot when I went through that, and it wasn't enough to like teach me a lesson. I kept doing the things that I had to do in order to make money and pay for lawyers to get myself out of trouble. And it didn't work, right? I got into prison. And it's really weird, because when you're in a situation like that, you definitely think your life is over, and you definitely think that there isn't a future in it for you anymore. And I think you definitely give up. But I realized that I'm still alive, and I can't give up. And for me, my reality is since I wasn't a citizen at that point, I was going to go to another country, and that terrified me. And immigration, for those of you who don't have it hanging over your heads, is a terrifying thing when you've never been to the country they want to send you to. In my case, they wanted to send me to India, Venezuela, and Argentina. They didn't quite care as long as I went to one of them. And I don't know any of those countries. Tangent, so I don't want to get into it. But the point is while sitting in this place and having all these terrifying thoughts, I had this weirdest experience where I was watching somebody go home. And I was sitting in a self-help group that I was like forced to be in, and I'm happy I was there. But the weirdest thing happened is where all the truths that I had been hiding about myself as a person, that even my best friends didn't know until like a year ago, about how life was back at home for me back then. I started spewing it out like it's like verbal puke, and this guy's looking at me like kind of looking like, he's like, dude, it's my day to go home. What the hell are you saying? And I just started doing this whole big thing where I don't know where it was coming out of. I mean, the tears were flowing, and it was just this really weird thing. I can't quite describe it, but I do know that that's a day in my life that I've never forgotten, and I don't want to forget, because I feel like I did my second 180 in that point. And from that point in my life, I started to live a expression that I had heard. And the expression is that children take choices and adults make decisions. And I felt that I had lived my life up to that point as a child taking the choice that was available to me, do this and do that. And for the first time in my life, I made a decision to be somebody better than I was. I'm a web developer today. I'm an IT manager technically for my company. And it's been a really broad transition, but I think what I want to say is, you know, just when you think you got it figured out, and just when you think everybody's happy for you, like life throws a curve at you. And like I'm in the middle of a process right now. In fact, it's not done for me. I'm transitioning yet again, and it's because I'm dealing with different personal things. So I would say that I did a 360 and probably doing like another 60 on top of that, because that's where I'm transitioning from being, you know, the coder, mentor, family guy to like IT manager, mentor, family guy. And that's a really big difference, because for those of you that know tech know that coding and IT is two totally different things. But the reason I'm making the change is because I got to a point where life was extremely stressful for me, and the situation blew up, and it was a team effort to put it together. But you know, like I look back on the situation and I said I need to take a step back. And you know, I want to be transparent about that, because I think that sometimes it's easy to look at others and maybe ourselves and be like, oh look, they got it figured out, I just need to figure it out. And I just want to say that it's not always figured out. I'm definitely, you know, still in that process. But I'm very appreciative to learn from other people and be here and share and update you guys periodically as I'm invited to do so. But yeah, you know, I think if I was to sum it up, what has always changed me or created the catalyst was in people knowing my truth. At first, it was me hiding it, and what set me free was me being open about it and putting it out there. So, yeah.
Nancy?
Well, hi. My name is Nancy Janis, and your question is singularly easy for me, which is, what is an obstacle that you have had to overcome? And the obstacle that I've had to overcome was an old blue van. I was out for a bike ride, having been a serious bike rider, not a competitive bike rider, but a serious bike rider, putting in lots of miles every week. And I belong to a local bicycle club. We live in Florida. In fact, I'm still adjusting to the weather here. But anyway, I was out going to join the bike club, and I had ridden a block from my house and made a right turn onto a street that's perpendicular to where we live, and a woman driving an old van hit me from behind. And so I spent the next 7 months in the hospital and came out of this with a spinal cord injury. And I've learned so much about spinal cord injuries now, and about the spinal cord and all that. And I can tell you, by way of just to inform you, that when you have a spinal cord injury, wherever it happens to occur along the length of your spinal cord, that part of the actual cord, whatever vertebrae area it occurs at, that part of your spinal cord controls a particular part of your body. Now, I knew none of this, of course, but I would say, unfortunately for me, the place that I have the injury is at the lower vertebrae of my neck, and that controls the hands. So my hands don't work, and I'm a college professor, so I'm on the computer all the time and dealing with hands that don't work and using a stylus to poke at the computer. And have had to basically refashion my life as an older person who's a disabled person from having been a very able-bodied and pretty youthful old person before. Now, what has that meant in terms of changes? There's so much that you have to learn when you become disabled. There's one other small thing I should tell you while I'm giving you your biology lesson. Any part of your body below the point of the injury can be impaired. And so what all that means is that if you have a high spinal cord injury, like I think most of you would remember Christopher Reeve, Christopher Reeve was around cervical vertebra number 3. And so he had very little left below after that injury. I'm very lucky, really, although I don't feel lucky all the time. But I'm lucky that what is damaged below the site of my injury is fundamentally only my ability to walk. And I'm extremely grateful for that. Now that's kind of weird to say I'm really grateful that I can't walk. But what I'm most grateful about that is that I have bladder control and bowel control. And most people who have spinal cord injuries and things down below are affected in that way. And that makes me really happy. It makes me just really delighted, I guess is what I should say. So, how has becoming injured, or how did the ladies' van change my life? Number one, I was never a sitter-arounder kind of person. I was never a person who was drawn to going to the movies because it was like, golly, I'm going to be sitting there for 2 hours when I could be doing something. So I've had to learn how to be a sitter-arounder. And I'm not crazy about that, of course, but you know, you do what you have to do. It just gives me more time to poke at the computer. Probably one of the very most difficult things is that when you become disabled later in life, and I was really an independent kid, like from the time I was little all the way until the point of my injury, I guess I would say, all of a sudden you have to ask people to help all the time. And that doesn't go down easily when you've been really independent and not asked people for help. So that's been a big learning for me, to ask for help and to feel that people don't really kind of resent the time they're about to give you. Now, I happen to be married to an absolutely wonderful human being who happens to be sitting in the audience and could maybe stand up and wave to you all because he's so special. And I would say that were it not for that wonderful human being, things would be so very different. For example, we have 3 daughters whom we adopted when we were in our 40s, so our daughters have collected like grandparent parents. And they're now grown, but if Brian goes out of town and I need to go to the bathroom, I've kind of gotten to the point now I can transfer myself from the wheelchair to the toilet. But if for some reason I see difficulty in doing that and I tell the girls, what do you suppose is the first question? Oh, Mom, do you have to poop? And so I've had to learn to ask for things that maybe other people aren't going to be thrilled to have to give. As far as my job is concerned, my life's been super consistent. I was a French teacher when I was young. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I was an English teacher, became a French teacher, became a school psychologist, and eventually became, collecting a few graduate degrees along the way, became a college professor. And I've been doing that for a really long time, I think since 1976. It's nice to be in Colorado because I never tell my own students how old I am. But anyway, so my life's been really consistent in that way, in that I've been doing the same thing. So it's different now in this regard. I'm at the same level always as my students. That's fine. I mean, I used to sit on the desk sometimes, but now I sit in the circle with them. And that works out really just well, just fine. But in other situations, for example, last night we had a lovely dinner sponsored by the Alumni Association, and there I was gazing at everybody's navels. That takes some getting used to. And because my injury was in my neck, I can't look up very well. So it's hard for me to make eye contact with people talking to me. If I really, really try hard, I can look at their breasts. So this is something that's required adjustment. I find that I'm not as confident as I used to be. I think that I'm still a good teacher. My students tell me that I am. But I find it's much easier for me now to walk out of the classroom and think, oh God, that was an awful class, than it used to be. I used to walk out, feeling confident that it had been a good class. And so there have been changes like that have occurred. But on the bright side, on the good news side, the very best part of my job was always that I loved to travel with students. And at my school, Eckerd College in St. Pete, Florida, we have a winter term, which is a 1-month semester in January. And you can teach on campus or you can teach abroad if you wish. And I did that for many years, and I just loved it. For me, it was like having a big family and introducing the kids to the bigger world was something that I just loved. And as soon as I became able to think after the accident, that was what I thought about, and that, oh my gosh, that's over now. So in 2017, in the fall, I was hired to teach on Semester at Sea, and that was a wonderful, wonderful thing. We went to 10 different countries and lots of countries in development. And Brian and I got off the ship and I discovered, hey, I can still travel. I can still be in developing countries. I can still see all the new sights and meet the people. So based on that confidence, I wrote a proposal again to take students to Cambodia. And we did that in January. This past January, I took 16 kids, with Brian's help, to Cambodia to do a field study of human trafficking. And honestly, it was a wonderful trip for the kids. But for me, I think it was an unbelievable trip because I discovered what I could still do. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you, for just sharing your story so candidly and honestly. There are the producers going around that you can write your questions for. We give priority if you are a student, and you can just write that on your note card. And so the first question coming from a student is, how does having a devastating moment happen in your life encourage you to make change?
I would say for me, one of the cool things about, I say, overcoming death or having these live-iversaries is that it was really interesting listening to you, Nancy, because I think on some levels, too, it's given me more confidence where I go, do you know what? If I can manage to get over these things, given it's been with a lot of help, shout out to my mom who was with me every day of rehab, and my husband who's not here, but couldn't do it without him. But I think having seen what you can lose, because at first it was, oh my gosh, am I ever going, well, I was just happy to be alive. And so I didn't know after my accident, one, if I'd have to get my leg amputated because so little of my tibia was left, or two, if I'd ever walk again. And then once those things happened, it was just kind of like, wow, if I can handle that, let's throw it at me, which I better watch what I say, but that's been my approach since then. So it has given me more confidence to roll with the punches to some extent.
Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'd love to say, I woke up in a hospital bed and realized it's not actually a dream, and started putting two and two together and realizing that something was wrong with me, and I didn't quite know know what. And it took a few days to start to literally be able to open my eyes and see that something didn't look right. And then like another week before I was able to walk enough to stand in front of a mirror and say, holy shit, you look like a raccoon. Because I had a skin grafts put over my face and they darkened and it looked like I was wearing like a mask. And, you know, it might sound like total BS, but I mean, like in that moment, like I started thinking about how to just make light of the situation. I was so thankful to be alive, but within like 10 minutes of realizing that there was skin grafts on my hands, I came up with the joke about telling people like, I don't want to tell you where they put my butt cheeks because you've been shaking them. You know,
I've known you for 2 years, and now you finally tell me.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't actually know if that's the case, but it was my approach at just trying to survive. It was hella hard. They gave me a lot of different meds to deal with the things that were going on in my head I couldn't contemplate. But I think the overall trend for what helped me figure out how to move forward is that I just got left alone. And I realized nobody was going to come, and I had to look at a shower, and I had to get into it and change my pressure garments and watch crazy amounts of blood go down the drain and realize, like, it's okay to feel sorry for yourself. And I gave myself 7 seconds to feel sorry. And then I said, now you need to pull your shit together because nobody's going to come and get you out of the shower. And I just realized at that point, like, I have to be self-sufficient. Because, like, it's just, nobody's there for me. I wish I had a wonderful person in my life, but she walked out, and I'm fine with that because I have a wonderful wife. My life never would, and I have a wonderful child right now that I'm raising in addition to my wonderful 2 stepdaughters, and I'm very happy for the way things worked out. But you know, I think that just in my situation is I couldn't expect anybody else to help. So, because my reality again was that nobody cared. The way it was. That being said, it turned out really good. And like I said, I'm super happy to be married to a wonderful woman and just have a little boy that he's only 2.5 months old. And hopefully he's watching me on the live stream right now because I wish I was there with him. Although I'm really excited with you guys. So.
That's great.
Okay, I'll speak. You know, it never occurred to me that I could have died. I couldn't quite believe it when I came to that this had happened to me. And right down, I was in 4 different hospitals, and right down to the end, in the last hospital, I used to think about our bedroom at home being carpeted, whereas the hospital floor was tiled. And so I was sure that as soon as I got home, I'd get up and walk. Because if I fell, at least it was carpet and it wasn't tile. And so that was something that was I guess I should say, an unpleasant surprise. But it hasn't quite worked. I've gotten to the point now that I can stand up by myself next to the bed, so I won't be racing across the room on the carpet after all. I've learned from the accident, or from becoming disabled, I guess, that to set up like little tests for myself. Now, I guess this is being a teacher for so long, but I'll set up these little tests to see if I can achieve them. And of course, I always see myself achieving them in my imagination. And so it's very frustrating when I can't achieve them, but when they really are beyond what I can do. But I achieve a lot of them. A lot of these little things, and I think that that's really been a change and a really good thing. Another thing is that, you know, I hear a lot from people that I stay, despite everything that's happened, I stay sunny and so forth. And I also learned in the hospital that one, at least in Florida, when one has a spinal cord injury, they practically immediately put you on antidepressants. Now, in my life, I was never a person who would have needed antidepressants. Both my mom and I were both people of very stable, emotionally stable, and just generally stable personalities. So they started giving me these antidepressants, and I didn't know what I was taking. I just took whatever they gave me. So now, 7 years later, I'm still taking those antidepressants. And sometimes when people say, well, you managed to stay so cheerful, I think, well, it's a fake. It's because I'm taking antidepressants. And I don't know if that's the case or if that's not the case. But I can tell you that when I forget them, like for a couple of days, then I get so weepy and so miserable. And I'm going to share just a really short story because it is pretty funny. When my daughter, the youngest one, graduated from college, she just graduated in 2016, we drove up to South Carolina to see her graduate and all, and forgot to bring my antidepressants with us. So I was fine the first day, and I was tolerable the second day. The third day, it was time to go home. And so my daughter was coming home 2 days later, and she stood on the porch of the house that she was living in, waved goodbye to us, and of course I started blubbering in the car, telling myself, oh my God, Nancy, she's coming home in 2 days. Well, then it continued to get worse to the point that we stopped at a convenience store on the way home. And there was my oldest daughter was with us as well. And Brian went into the convenience store to buy a hot dog or whatever he went in for. And I looked at the window of the convenience store, and it had these big beer posters on it, like all the way across the window. So I said to my daughter, Elena, if you go to a club or something, what kind of beer do you drink? Then I remember the first poster was Coors, and I said, do you drink Coors? No. And then maybe the next was Bud. Do you drink Bud? No. Well, we got to the fourth poster, and she had said no to every one, and I started crying because I felt so sorry for the posters. So these have been changes I never would have expected in my life.
Oh, that's great.
I guess this is mine.
Brandon, are you good? Chris, you want to share in on that?
I don't know that I've had one devastating life event. I've had challenges. I am curious about, for Brandon, I'm interested in this concept of reintegration. So I feel like if I lost a loved one to police brutality, or Tulio, I don't know if the audience knows this, but working at the prison that you were imprisoned at, right?
Yeah. The same officers that remember me, the ones that hold a grudge and the ones that like me.
So I'm curious about the strength to reintegrate, and then how you combat distress, laboring in a space that's, it would have to wear on you.
Well, I think Tulio said something that really made me think about where I am in my journey. And I hope that y'all don't believe that because we have microphones, we're at like the tail end of our journey with like figuring all this shit out, because we are not. Well, let me speak for myself. I definitely ain't. I'm certainly in the middle of that journey. And some of the things that I had to deal with were, and I talked about this a little earlier. Chris and I had the pleasure of being on a panel earlier today. And when you see on a daily basis African-American men, black and brown boys and girls being shot and killed by police officers, and nothing ever happened to those police officers, you start to wonder what your value is in a world. Right? You begin to think that you yourself are worthless. So the part about love and sort of getting back out there, which, right, so after you lose a person that you've fell in love with, what does it mean then to re-engage in intimate, meaningful relationships with other black boys, with other black girls, with other black men? And that was really difficult for me. So I'll say in a couple of ways that it impacted me. My self-esteem was certainly impacted, right? So like, how do I show up in a world where society continues to tell me and teach me, ingrain in my psyche that my value isn't worth being considered at the end of the day, right? And the expectations that I would have of my partner if I don't believe I'm worthy of their love and care. The impact that that has also on the way others perceive me. So I am uniquely qualified to talk, I guess, about black men because I'm both professionally and personally, I date other African American men. And so in that context, if a black man also considers, is in the same position I'm in, right? Having to deal and grapple with this question of worthiness in a world of anti-blackness. So what does he find in himself to be able to contribute to a relationship? And I don't know if any of you have ever been in love before, but you know, the shit's kind of hard. It's not a walk in the park. It's already tough to deal with. And so I would say that the reintegration of any of that is sort of not like riding a bike, but it's more like falling in love and being open and vulnerable enough to be willing to have someone care for you to care for someone else, and that's kind of hard if you're afraid that you might lose this person to something as routine as a traffic stop. And so I think for me, it just required lots of faith, not in my partner, per se, but lots of faith that falling in love with another person wouldn't end up, that person wouldn't end up not here with me, not spending the rest of his life with me, so.
So we have one more student question here. Is there a 180 shift in anyone else's life that helped you get through with your own? Or have you found yourself using yours to help someone you love, which Brandon, you kind of just talked about a little bit there. Yeah.
I'd say one thing that surprised me is how much, even when we don't really think that our lives affect others, they do. And one example I have is when I was in the hospital in Chicago, there was a doctor who came to the room, and he wasn't even one of my doctors, but I told him the story, and he came back a couple months later. We followed up with him for some reason, or he followed up with us, and he said, you know what, like, your experience and your story has helped me realize how much more time I need to spend with my children, and I'm working so hard to provide for them, but I'm not giving them the quality time, and you really don't know how much you have. And so my big takeaway there was, one, if my story can help others, I'm all for that. And two, that my big takeaway with my accident was we're all so much more loved than we ever know. And it was a weird experience in terms of I got all these cards, and at 25 I felt like I was alive for my own funeral. But you really, each and every one of you, you're loved so much more than you ever know, and I hope you never have an experience where you realize that. But at the same time, I hope you know that.
For me, it's my sister. I was adopted by my grandma and my step-grandfather. My grandma, who I call my mom, has since passed, but my grandfather, step-grandfather, is still well and alive. He gets on my nerves all the time. But my sister and I were both adopted by them. We lived in a household we were originally born to a fairly poor family. We were raised by our grandparents in a more still modest but middle income household. And my father, his name's John, and John was a plant manager. He drove a forklift for almost 30 years at Dayton Tire building rubber. And he would have like 7 days at work and the 8th day off, right? That was his schedule. And my mom was a rental car clerk, a sales clerk, who would help to book people for their, basically their rental car, before we had Uber. And when my mom got sick, she had liver failure and needed a liver transplant. She was on dialysis for some time. My father quit his job, retired very early, and because my mother needed to go to Texas, we lived in Oklahoma, needed to go to Texas to sit near the hospital where the transplant would be ready. If you get on a transplant list, you normally have to be in the hospital within a certain amount of time, and basically they wouldn't have made it with the time they had to be in the hospital. So my dad moved my mom for a transplant at a location at a hotel in Houston, Texas, and basically built a fort in the waiting room for 3.5 months and said, I'm not leaving until my wife has a transplant. And so that was pretty inspiring. My mom has since passed, but during that time, my sister, my younger brother, my sister's older brother, got into a traffic accident where he's now mentally challenged. He was hit by an 18-wheeler. He lost his best friend who was in the driver's seat. He became paralyzed for some time and had 2% chance of living. And then he became on dialysis. So my sister's at home at her senior year of graduation of high school, taking care of, first of all, she's by herself with no parents. I know that would freak some of you all out, but there's no parents there. She's maybe 16 and a half, 17 max, and she's having to take care of her older brother who's on dialysis. Not only is she getting ready to go to college, but she's trying to prep for the Naval Academy, which, if you know anything about the Naval Academy in Annapolis, it is the #1 liberal arts school in the country. And you have to be nominated by your senator, both of them, and they only nominate one per state in order to go. My sister, not only did she take care of our brother, get him off of dialysis, graduate from high school at the top of her class, she went on to the Naval Academy, got her degree handed to her by the President of the United States at that time, President Barack Obama. And not only did she graduate, but she graduated top of her class, one of 13 black women to ever do that in the history of the university, right? And she's now at Columbia taking on her PhD. Now, that's the part where you clap. And for me, so basically, and I don't know how old I was, but I was a little older than she, and she had earned her degree well before I had, and so that was really inspirational for me. But just recently in September, a day before Breast Cancer Awareness Month in October, a few days before, my sister was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. And so now she's in New York, she's all by herself, and she's really struggling, right? You know, she's lost all her hair, she's finished chemo, but that basically means her nails are falling off. She has face full of acne. She doesn't consider herself pretty. She goes through these cycles of depression. And I don't really know how to show up for her, right? I've always seen my sister as like this strong woman to overcome everything. And it's been interesting. And I'll close with this. I asked her, I said, when she told me that she had breast cancer, I thought, well, you're gonna, this is just another one of those things that you're gonna get past, and we're gonna write about this later. And my sister told me, well, actually, Brandon, I wanna be valued not because I'm a strong woman. I wanna be valued because you're able to recognize and acknowledge the humanity, even during the times when I'm in the middle of that journey and I haven't came out at the end of it. So I think that what that taught me, if anything, each of us in this room, is to celebrate the journey we're in. And we might not be at the end of that journey. We might not have what we want. We might not be as perfect as we thought we would be, or that we will be eventually. But take time to really celebrate where we are in the middle of that journey. Yeah.
I think that's the perfect way to end this conversation and to really allow the dialogue to continue in regards to how we're using these things as motivation for others and for ourselves. So I thank all of our panelists for everything that they shared, and we look forward to sharing these stories more as we go along.